use for the rest of my project. Like all of the responses are kept 100% anonymous. I don't have any like your email, like your name, anything like that. Just the information that you give me as part of the questionnaire. It would be really, really brilliant if you wouldn't mind filling that out, just because it allows me to do the rest of my project. Essentially, it gives me some data to analyze. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that would be absolutely brilliant. If you want to pause the video and do that and come back, but I'll just get started. So thank you very much for filling out the pre-talk questionnaire. That's hugely appreciated. But I'll just get on with it now. So this presentation is going to be on birth control and the stress response. What isn't on the label, what your doctor didn't tell you. So this is a public engagement honours project by myself, Claire McGarvey, for my degree in neuroscience from Glasgow University. So I'll just get going. First, I'm going to start off with how birth control works. So hormonal birth control, generally speaking, in this presentation, we're going to be talking about the pill because that is where most of the research is. So I'm going to be referring to the pill a lot. But anyway, moving on. So the pill causes estrogen and progesterone to be released into the blood. And this then causes a lack of natural peaks and troughs in your natural hormonal cycle. So in the top graph here, we can see that estrogen levels rise over time and then fall, and this causes ovulation. And at this same time, you've got progesterone peaking and falling, and at the end of that fall is your period. So that's the natural hormonal cycle that signals these sorts of events. But when you're taking birth control, it basically results in really stable, flat hormone levels, which stop you from ovulating. And then when you stop taking the pill for a week, say, if you take your pill 3 weeks on, 1 week off, that causes your period because it essentially disrupts the normal hormone levels that your body's used to. So this inhibits an egg from being released because it stops ovulation, and this then stops you getting pregnant. And that is essentially how birth control works. It's releasing hormones into your bloodstream to stop you from releasing an egg. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what hormones are and how they act in the body and all that sort of thing. So the target of the hormones released by birth control is the reproductive system. However, it is impossible to localize these effects. So hormones act on receptors, and receptors are able to receive the message of a hormone and able to have an effect within the cell. Hormones and receptors are a little like a phone. So when someone calls a particular number, which is the hormone, that message, which is the phone call, is picked up by the phone that corresponds with that number, so the receptor. So if you think of your home landline, it's likely that you may have had multiple different phones in different rooms within your house, which are able to pick up on a call. So receptors work in a similar way. There are receptors all over the body which are able to pick up the same hormone, i.e. lots of different phones which are able to pick up the same call. And it's impossible to specifically call the upstairs phone over the downstairs phone. And the same is true of hormones and receptors. So when a hormone is released into the bloodstream, it's impossible to target specific groups of receptors anywhere in the body, for example, the reproductive system. And whenever that hormone is picked up by a receptor, it will have an effect. So if there's estrogen receptors in your brain, it'll have an effect in your brain. If there's ones in your heart, your lungs, your liver, wherever they are, estrogen will have an effect there. So that's what I mean by hormones, and that's essentially how they work. So hormonal birth control has many side effects, as I'm sure anyone who's ever taken it is aware. So side effects in and of itself is quite an interesting term, as there's technically no such thing as a side effect. All side effects are just unwanted or off-target effects. So hormonal birth control can often be exploited for these side effects, such as like regulating mood, which can have the opposite effect in some people who have mood swings on birth control they never had before. Clearing acne, again, this can have the opposite effect in some people and cause skin problems they never had before. There are also a couple of totally unwanted effects, such as like weight gain and an increased risk in blood clots. Birth control is often used to regulate painful and heavy periods, as birth control causes what's known as a withdrawal bleed, as we mentioned before, which is the body's reaction to no longer being exposed to consistent levels of hormones. and these withdrawal bleeds are often much lighter and less painful than a period. So we can see from this that hormonal birth control has effects all throughout the body, not just within the reproductive system. So a much less commonly known about or reported side effect, but equally important one, is birth control's effect on the stress response. And that's what the rest of this presentation will aim to explain, is what I mean by the stress response and birth control's effect on it. So there are multiple different types of stress. There is the classical feeling of stress. This is a type of stress which is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system and results in increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, nausea, overwhelming feeling, and all the other symptoms that are associated with stress. So there's also a form of stress which has a much subtler appearance, and this is the stress response which is mediated by the HPA axis. So what is the HPA axis? It's an axis which starts in your brain in the hypothalamus and ends on the top of your kidneys at the adrenal gland and causes a release in cortisol. So this stress is not what we think of in the classical sense. This type of stress is a pathway which allows for the body to recognize and adapt to meaningful events. So these meaningful events can have all sorts of forms, from any strong emotion to encountering a predator. As with most things in biology, this mechanism originates back from when we were nomadic peoples, and surviving and reproducing was one of our only concerns. So therefore, one of the major mechanisms of the HPA axis was to aid us in evading predators. So cortisol is the main thing that happens as a result of the HPA axis and as a result of its activation. So one of the main concerns of cortisol is to essentially allow us to run away from predators, allow us to evade predators. So some of the effects that cortisol has in this vein is deposition of fat and sugar into the bloodstream, which allows for us to run away from things and gives us energy to do so. It also increases memory formation when cortisol spikes, as is essentially helping us to notice and remember the situations that we have got ourselves into to be encountering this predator so that we don't do it again. So many of the effects of cortisol are as a result of a sudden surge, as the release of cortisol inhibits any further release, and cortisol in the blood is quickly broken down. This is done as constant cortisol release is quite detrimental to the body. So these effects include but aren't limited to immune suppression, digestive issues, weight gain, heart disease, problems with memory and concentration, anxiety, depression, and sleep issues. So therefore, ensuring that cortisol levels are well regulated is vitally important. So this is what I mean by stress for the rest of this talk, is the activation of the HPA axis as a result of a meaningful stimulus resulting in the release of cortisol. So now we're going to move on to talk about how hormonal birth control affects the stress response and cortisol and its release. So we'll first talk about psychological stress and how that can be affected in women taking hormonal birth control. So there's been lots of studies that have looked at this. So the graph on this slide here is just from one of these studies. So even though the N number, which is the number of participants in each group, is 6, there is a lot of other studies that back this up. So psychological stress should, in pretty much all healthy individuals, result in the release of cortisol. So this group of researchers looked at the effect of psychological stress on cortisol release. So they used the TSST test to induce stress, which has people count back from 1022 in multiples of 13 and also present their suitability of employment to a panel of unimpressed looking individuals. So the baseline levels of cortisol were pretty much the same in both groups. So we've got the control group here, which is women who are not taking any kind of hormonal birth control, and then the OC group is women taking oral contraceptives. So both groups showed pretty similar baseline cortisol levels. However, when they induced this psychological stress, women taking oral contraceptives didn't see a cortisol response when you compare that with the control group, which did see a marked cortisol increase as a result of this psychological stress. So even though both groups felt equally stressed, women taking oral contraceptives did not release cortisol in the same way that control women did. So a different group of researchers then looked at the effect of strenuous exercise on cortisol release. So strenuous exercise should, in pretty much all healthy individuals, cause cortisol to be released. So in this experiment here, they had women cycle on a stationary bike until they were exhausted. So again, our control is women who aren't taking hormonal birth control, and the OC is women who are taking oral contraceptives. So both groups of women had similar heart rates, worked at similar levels, reported similar feelings of exhaustion, had the same performance metrics, all the rest of it, but they didn't release cortisol to the same extent as control women did. They had a significantly lowered cortisol release as a response to this exercise when compared to the control. So this was quite interesting because you really should release cortisol as a result of strenuous exercise, and it implies that there's something going wrong with the cortisol releasing system if they don't release any in response to psychological stress or to strenuous exercise. So this made researchers wonder if they could even deal with excess cortisol. Like what about this pathway is going wrong? Are they able to take up cortisol when there's too much of it? So in this study here, instead of women who aren't taking hormonal birth control, men were used instead. They are seen here in the black line. The placebo is the solid line, and the dashed line is when cortisol is released. And then women are seen in women using hormonal birth control are seen in the grey line. Again, the solid line is the placebo, and the dashed line is when cortisol was given. So it would be expected that the body is able to clear excess cortisol when it's synthetically injected, which is what happened here. These two groups were they were injected a dose of synthetic cortisol and then measured to see how long it took for the body to essentially deal with this cortisol and get rid of it. So men, here we can see there's an increase in cortisol when it's administered, and then it slowly is degraded in the bloodstream. It doesn't quite reach baseline levels, but it's relatively close. Whereas when we look at women taking hormonal birth control, there's a huge increase in cortisol when it's released or when it's injected into the bloodstream, but it's not cleared very well by the body. And by 190 minutes after the injection, there is still a lot of cortisol in the bloodstream. So this implies women taking birth control are not able to process excess cortisol when it's administered, which is interesting, dangerous, all the rest of it. So this begs the question, why aren't women taking birth control able to release cortisol when they should and get rid of it when there's too much of it? So one of the theories is an increase in cortisol binding globulin, which is what takes up cortisol in order to make it biologically inactive. So cortisol exists in two forms: free cortisol, which is biologically active, and then bound cortisol, which is biologically inactive. And the two forms together make up total cortisol. So women taking birth control have higher levels of total cortisol, and they also have higher levels of cortisol binding globulin and cortisol bound to that cortisol binding globulin. So therefore, women taking birth control produce more cortisol, but it's taken up by cortisol binding globulin and made inactive. So they can't produce cortisol in response to stress because the cortisol releasing system, or the HPA axis, is already overwhelmed and releasing as much cortisol as it is able to. They also can't remove excess cortisol when it's administered because all of the cortisol binding globulin is already used up in binding the cortisol that's already being released. So the mechanism underlying like increase of cortisol binding globulin is kind of unknown, but the idea that there is more cortisol binding globulin in women who are taking hormonal birth control is pretty well established. So this made researchers wonder whether women taking contraceptives essentially experience biological chronic stress, or the biomarkers that can be seen when someone is chronically stressed and therefore chronically releasing cortisol, as psychological stress induces cortisol release. So this isn't chronic stress in the sense of feeling stressed all the time. This is your body essentially feeling like it's under attack all the time. So there's quite a few biological markers of this that you can measure. These include activation of certain areas of DNA and then the attempted reversal of this activation. and then an increase in fat in the blood, as we said earlier, cortisol release causes fat to be deposited in the blood to aid the flight response. There could also be seen to be a reduction in the brain area, the hippocampus, in individuals with chronic stress. This is because the hippocampus is really vulnerable to damage and degradation, and chronic stress stops mechanisms that help the hippocampus to stay healthy, as the body is too concerned with essentially not getting eaten by a predator of some description. So these kind of mechanisms are put on the back burner. As the hippocampus is an area of the brain which is involved in learning and memory, there's a lot of neuron formation and synapses and all that sort of thing. There's just a lot of activity in this area of the brain. So keeping it healthy essentially just requires a lot of upkeep that the body's not able to do when it feels like it's under attack. So a study was done on 223 women, a third of which were using birth control, and they found that the women taking birth control showed all of these 4 features of chronic stress, which is really, interesting, it's scary, all those kinds of things, that women taking birth control, their bodies essentially feel like they're constantly under attack. So these are some of the effects of disrupted cortisol signaling and how that can be linked to some of the symptoms of birth control and maybe what the underlying mechanisms of these symptoms might be. So a disrupted HPA axis has been linked with mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression, and many women on the pill do report an increase in depressive symptoms and difficulty in regulating their mood whilst on birth control. So this HPA axis dysfunction may be where those depressive symptoms come from. A disrupted HPA axis has also been linked with difficulties of learning and memory. And as we just said, chronic stress negatively impacts our ability to learn by decreasing the brain area, the hippocampus, which is involved heavily in learning and memory. And many women on the pill do report brain fog and other memory impairments. So that might be where some of those symptoms come from. Chronically elevated cortisol levels also lead to an increase in fat and sugar in the blood, which is linked with obesity and other metabolic disorders such as diabetes, and cortisol causes the release of fat and sugar into the blood. So many women on the pill do report weight gain and difficulty in losing weight. So this may come from, again, a disrupted HPA axis and chronic cortisol release. However, it's not all bad. This may seem like this presentation is all an attack on birth control. However, this talk is not a holistic representation of all the wide-ranging pros and cons of birth control. And since its advent in the 1950s, hormonal birth control has allowed women freedom in so many aspects of their life. It's allowed them freedom within their relationships, within their personal lives, within their careers. It's allowed them to pursue whatever they want without the fear that they may fall pregnant, and has allowed them ownership over this decision to become a mother whenever suits them and whenever fits best into their lives. Many women also have conditions such as endometriosis and PCOS, and they're only able to manage their symptoms through birth control. These women should be allowed to do so and should be empowered to do so. However, women are so often left out of biological and medical research, and they deserve to make a well-informed decision based on all the information that's out there. This is not an attack on anyone taking birth control or anyone who, knowing this information, still chooses to take birth control. However, all people deserve to make a fully informed decision on any medication they choose to take. And with this information being widely reported within primary literature since the 1990s, to me, it feels like women have been kept in the dark about this for too long. This is all I aim to do in this presentation, is to inform, is to give women information that they didn't previously have and allow them to make the most informed decision that they can. So any decisions you make are your own, and they should be made to serve your best interests and nobody else. So thank you so very much for listening. Thank you for all your attention. I hope you learned something that you didn't know before. I know I certainly didn't know any of this until I started doing this project, and it's something I've grown to be really passionate about, and I just really hope you learned something as a result of this video. There is a post-hoc questionnaire. If you would be able to fill that out, that would mean the world to me, as it just gives me information that I can write up for my project. So thank you again so much for listening. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.